All right, hi everybody, John Meadows here, and today I want to talk about something I think is pretty fun to talk about. So we're going to talk about some old school versus new school methods. I'm in an interesting position that I've actually lived in both. So I did bodybuilding in the 80s and 90s, and then I've done new school, we'll call it the last 10, 15 years. So I've been able to kind of go through this whole thing myself and have a perspective on it. But it's always a good discussion, old school versus new school. When I wanted to talk about a variety of subjects, we have our lucky number 7, actually. 7 things to talk about. So the first one would be meal timing. Now, my first probably 15 years, maybe 20 years of bodybuilding, 6 meals a day. And I can tell you I did not miss one meal. And that's pretty much what everybody did. The bigger guys sometimes even did 7. But nobody was doing 3 meals, 4 meals. I don't want to say nobody. There's always somebody. But most of us did 6 meals a day. That's all we did. You get up, you had breakfast, you had your mid-morning snack, you had your lunch, you had your afternoon snack, you had your pre-workout and your post-workout if you worked out in the evening, or you had those in the morning, and then you staggered 4 more meals after that. So as information has become more available in the last 10 years, now we know that maybe you don't need 6 meals. Maybe you could do 5 meals. Maybe you could do 4. I will say this. I still have a lot of people that have a difficult time with 2 meals and 3 meals. That approach does not seem to be the best for gaining muscle. But there does seem to be some flexibility if you're getting in all the calories that you need with 5 meals and 4 meals. So now it's nice because you can have a little bigger lunch, for example, and not have to worry about the snack. And when I travel, that's exactly what I do. I have less meals, but they're a little bigger, and I never lose any muscle. In fact, sometimes I look better when I eat like that. But just generally speaking, there's some flexibility now in the number of meals that you have to eat. You don't have to have a gigantic meal or a big meal every 2.5 hours. Now, not saying that doesn't work, because if anybody says 6 meals doesn't work, they're not living in reality. Then if that was the case, then how could there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of successful bodybuilders that did that? So it does work. But what I am saying is if you don't have the lifestyle, if your work doesn't permit that, you can still bodybuild and you can do it well with 4 or 5 meals. Okay. Number 2 is cardio. I think that in the old days, we really didn't see any of the bad side of cardio. And what I mean by that is many people would do a lot of sessions for long periods of time. I remember a period of time when this was my cardio session. This was in the mid 90s. My cardio session was I would walk at night until I felt my blood sugar dropping because I was getting lightheaded. Until that happened, I walked. That could be 30 minutes, that could be 2 hours. So when I felt my blood sugar had completely tanked, then I would go to bed and I would go to sleep. And my thought process was, okay, all the carbs are out of me. Now as I'm sleeping, I'll just burn megatons of fat. It's pretty brutal. And it actually did work. But guess what? I actually lost a lot of muscle doing that. So probably wasn't the optimal approach. Now we know that excessive cardio can create a lot of muscle protein breakdown, a lot of cortisol, I would say a chronically high level of cortisol. Cortisol is not a bad thing when it's an acute spike, but chronically high levels of cortisol, it creates a state of overtraining. High levels of cardio will make you more susceptible to being overtrained, and particularly when you throw in a low calorie diet and then somebody dieting on top of that, and then also high intensity training as well, which creates a lot of muscle protein breakdown. So now I think people are a little wiser with cardio, and they're figuring out, okay, maybe 40, 45 minutes a day is plenty. Maybe I don't need to go nuts for 2 hours a day. So I think we're doing a little better job there. And if a coach is having you do 2 hours of cardio all the time, there's probably some other things that are wrong with your program. Sleep. So I remember in the 90s, we used to actually try to stay up because unless you're using that cardio method, because where you lower your blood sugar, because then you just passed out. But one of the things we used to do was we thought, well, if you stay up longer, you're burning more calories. So I'm going to get a lot leaner if I just don't sleep as much. Now, we know a lot more about sleep. Sleep is probably the hottest topic in the last 3 or 4 years. I talk about it every seminar I do. But when you are doing what essentially is sleep deprivation, which is 6 hours, 5 hours, 4 hours, there's a lot of bad things that happen. The hormone that your gut creates called ghrelin spikes, so that makes you hungry. That's the hormone that makes you feel hungry. The hormone that your fat cells produce called leptin, that's a satiety hormone that tells your body, hey, okay, I'm full. That lowers, so you're not full. And also we know that increase in ghrelin actually makes you crave more sugar. So that happens. You have chronically higher cortisol levels. So your body's releasing insulin, trying to clear blood sugar all the time. And then there's a lot of muscle protein breakdown from cortisol. Cortisol, that's one of the things that it does. So not sleeping, turns out, is a very bad idea. So now I take it very, very serious how my clients are sleeping. I don't tell them to stay up later. And honestly, 20 years ago, I used to do that. Why don't you stay up 2 hours later? Just burn some more calories. So I think now we're a little better. Taste, food. So back in the old days, it didn't matter what food tasted like. We boiled our chicken breast. We got sodium-free chicken breast. I remember I ate low-sodium tuna. Baked potatoes were always plain. Sweet potatoes are plain. Fish was plain. Basically, everything was plain. And then at some point, somebody started using Mrs. Dash. And I remember the first time. I was like, oh, does that have sodium in it? And they were like, no, and it tastes good. So I used it. And I thought, wow, this doesn't have sodium in it. And it tastes really good. So then I was wondering, well, what if I got some spices that actually had sodium in them? Would that be a bad thing? So I got like buffalo wing sauce to put on my chicken, to put on my fish. Has a pretty high amount of sodium. So I go through the diet and I'm like, wow, I don't look any worse. I think I feel kind of better from having a little sodium. So now we're much smarter. We see the value of sodium as it comes to muscle contractions, as it comes to keeping a fuller muscle. There's just a tremendous amount of benefits to not cutting salt. Cutting salt's a very bad idea unless you have some kind of medical reason to do that. So now we can actually enjoy our food a little bit more than what we used to. And I know what people say, at that point you should be a machine. I will say this though. You get to a point where you diet so hard, almost anything tastes good. I remember, my hardest diets I've ever done. You guys have heard about my egg white and low sugar ketchup diets. And I think I've told you about my college diets where all I ate was cans of tuna and maybe a potato or something when I trained. Even that tastes good when you get to a certain point in your diet. But my point is that I think the new school was much, much better. We can actually enjoy our food a little bit more, and that's a good thing. And what about macros? So our approach used to consistently be to get lean, you lowered your carbs. And that is in fact the same principle that I still use now with most people. But it's not the fact that I'm lowering carbs. It's the fact that I'm lowering calories. I could just have easily lowered fat and kept calories up. And I may do that for some people as well. So there's no magically lowering a macro that creates fat loss. It's the caloric deficit that you're creating. So if you want to keep your calories higher, and we see a lot more people now have higher calories. I was training with a guy today who's 10 weeks out, and he's eating 500-600 grams of carbs a day still, and he keeps his really high. And I have several clients like that as well. Well, back in the old days, we were bringing those carbs down. That's how you got lean. And we would routinely go down to 50 grams of carbs, or we would carb cycle where we would go 0, 0, 50, 100, or 0, 50, 100, 200. When really it's just a caloric deficit. So if you enjoy foods that are a little higher in fat, that's okay. If you enjoy foods that are a little higher in carbs, that's okay. So I'm going to say the new school wins again on that one. And what about training? This is a debate that you always hear. Well, the guys in the 80s and 90s trained harder. So this one I had to really think about because I can only tell you from my perspective of the gyms I trained at. I trained at, the Lifetimes of the world, and there used to be California Fitness. I trained at the old school world gyms. I've trained in a really good mix of gyms. And here's what I can tell you. Are there still guys that train their butts off and train really hard? Absolutely, there is. But generally speaking, when you go into most gyms, you'll see most people on their phones and you see very little intensity. That's what I see. Even in like a world type gym, even in gyms like that, even in Gold's Gym, that is what you will normally see. I was training yesterday at a gym, and we were waiting for the squat rack, and we had to wait probably 10, 15 minutes because there were a couple people sitting there taking pictures in the squat rack. And we had to kind of just wait for them because that's all they were doing was taking pictures. So I think the guys in the old days, I do think they train probably a little harder, but it goes more beyond social media. Let me give you a secondary reason. We weren't afraid to overtrain. In fact, you never heard the word overtraining. You'd go into the gym and you would train to exhaustion and you would leave. And at some point, people started talking about overtraining. Now, is overtraining real? Of course it's real. If you train a muscle fiber before it's repaired, if you train a muscle before all the fibers, if they're still damaged, you increase your chance of overtraining. If you're doing sky-high volumes for a long period of time, you have a high chance of getting into an overtrained state. Tons of cardio. All these things can create an overtrained state if it's done for a long period of time. Here's what, the new school is very concerned about overtraining and taking sets to failure. And if you go to failure, you're going to overtrain. You're going to create this fatigue. Does training hard create fatigue? Yes. But guess what? You're challenging your body. You want to create fatigue. You've got to create an adaptation. If you don't train hard, I would challenge you and say you're not going to have any adaptation unless you're a beginner. But if you're an intermediate or advanced guy, this irrational fear of overtraining that's perpetuated the industry today, coupled with social media in the gyms, I'm sorry, but I think the old school wins there. So this is one of the reasons why I like training with the younger guys now, because they can see, oh, this is how we train. It's not just do a set, take a picture, do a set, do a video. Oh, I'm three reps from being to failure, so I better stop now before I create too much fatigue. So there's a complete irrational fear of overtraining now. Is it real? Yes. How many people actually are at risk of being overtrained? It's a very low amount. So I got to go with the old school on that one. PEDs. So it's a topic that everybody talks about. I'm sure I'll get hundreds of comments on it in this video. The old school and the new school. Well, again, I was around then, I'm around now, and I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that the large majority of the guys now are using anywhere from 1.5 to double what the guys in the 80s and 90s were using. We had very open, candid conversations in the 80s and 90s about it, but we didn't even have them that often because most of our conversations were around nutrition and training. That's what we talked about. But we could say, hey, this guy, a couple mils of test, a couple mils of DECA. You had these old school cycles, just DECA and D-ball, or test and DECA. It was very, I think most of the people, of course you always had the exceptions, so don't get me wrong. But generally speaking, it was very reasonable. And if you're familiar with the where it is today, it's completely different. I'll give you an example, the GH. Back when people started using GH, it was 2-3 units after they trained. Now you're talking guys that do 20 units, which is an amazing amount. That's a very large amount of GH, and that's why we have some guys that are diabetics now. You take something like a trend where back in the old days, it was, we had these little 76 milligram ampules. You took 3 of those. So whatever 76 times 3 was the kind of the maximum dose. And now you have guys taking 1,000. Totally unnecessary. And that's what you see now, is you see that people think, and I think and I don't think it's because people are bad people. I just don't think they know. I think that in their minds, they really think they have to do all this stuff, this dose, to be successful, when that's not true. And most of the time when I run into these guys, we can cut it in half and they can do just as good, if not better, because they feel better. They don't feel sick. They don't feel, their liver's not inflamed. So I really like the way the conservative approach that the guys used back in the old days. Now, how has that resulted in the difference in how people look? Well, there's a lot of people out there that say the guys in the 80s and 90s looked harder than the guys now. I actually disagree with that. And let me tell you why I think that. In the 80s and 90s, you had more muscle separation. So think about a Sean Ray or a Charles Claremont. Look that guy up if you never heard of him. Look at the muscle separation between muscle groups that those guys had, the deep lines in their quads, the deep lines in their back. And that makes you look harder. It's a very nice quality of appearance. Like when somebody like that stands on stage, they look a lot bigger than what they were. When I watched Lee Labrada compete, for example, at the Arnold Classic, I don't know, Lee was 180, 185 pounds, but your eyes immediately went to him because he was very separated. Every muscle group had lines in it. He looked your eyes were just drawn to him. And even now you'll go to contests and you'll see a guy like that every now and then and your eyes will go right to that person. Now, were they leaner? I don't think so. I just think they had better muscle quality. I think the guys now are just as lean. They have strided glutes, but you don't have the muscle separation because of the high volumes of food, the high volumes of GH, the high volumes of insulin. Those things create size, but they don't help with detail. Dieting will get these guys lean, but they lose that separation. They get this what's called poofy muscle, right? Where it's really big and round. And, it used to be like when Lee Haney was competing, Lee was one of my favorites, 245, 250 pounds, he was a monster. And now all these guys weigh 240 or 250, but they don't look like Lee Haney. They just got this kind of bulbous look to their muscles. So I don't think the guys now are soft and fat. I think it's just a different look. It's just a different look. And I think that is really due to the excessive eating and the excessive chems. So I think that's the impact it's had on the bodies. So anyways, that's my 7. I would love to hear your thoughts on this stuff. So comment below. Let me know what you think, and we'll see you next time.